the outdoor the outing, the giveaway. We've actually been able to give away most of the bags that we had. I think we have something like maybe 20 left.
Ooh, very good.
That is a huge blessing. We were able to be a blessing to other people. And we've talked about before that that is part of what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to be fruitful. We're supposed to be able to give back and to share with other people to let them know that they are important. And why don't I have this link yet? Okay, that's what I was looking for. One of the things that I like about what we did, what we were able to do, is that everybody was involved. There was nobody just sitting on the sidelines, and it wasn't just the effort of one or two people trying to do all the work, but everybody shared in the load, and I believe that we were effective. I hope that people were blessed by it. At some point in time, we're going to look back and see what we could have done better, what we could be more effective at if everything that we did was as cost effective as possible. Thanks, Sam, for pitching in and helping out with that. Trying to multitask here, which I can do reasonably effective when I'm not ad-libbing, but this time I am ad-libbing, and so that's why I sound a little bit goofy and disjointed. I'm just trying to reset this because we actually did have 2 people watching us, so at the time that I ended up cutting the broadcast, I think I have to remember to mute the speakers because it loops itself, and you guys don't necessarily need to know about that. I'm just trying to figure out what happened while I'm talking. We're not going to worry about that, though. I just thank you guys for being here and for what we've done. We have not actually done this study in quite some time. We've had appointments to go to. We've had Sundays off. We had this to get ready for. So it's been quite a while since we have dealt with the subject matter of hearing God's voice. We've been away from it for like 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks. So I wanted to use this lesson, since it's the first time we've got together, as an opportunity to refresh our minds on what we have covered and go a little bit more in depth on a few things that came to mind as I started to go back over it. When I look back over what we've actually been getting into some pretty good stuff. It's easy to take for granted or not necessarily realize at the time, but to be honest with you, when I went back over and looked at stuff, I realized that some of this is where I've been living for the last few weeks. It hits things that I have been living and brought things back to mind that I had forgotten about. So sometimes you go through these lessons and you go through them one at a time and you go so in depth that you forget there's actually some very poignant, very powerful points that can help with life. So what I wanted to do, what you guys have in your study guide, is a list of all of the major points that we have hit so far over the last, I think, 7 lessons. And we got, I think, 12 points there. And we're going to touch on these one at a time and see what we remember, just to jog our memory. And I understand that asking you to remember things from 7 lessons ago or from 3 weeks ago is like pulling teeth, because we have so many things going on in life and there's so many things that happen. But this is kind of why we go back over it, is to try to reinforce it and help us remember it. So the first thing that we dealt with, we're dealing with hearing God's voice, how to hear God's voice. We're very good at talking to God. Most people, most Christians don't have much of a problem with that. Actually hearing from him, knowing if they've heard from him, can be a little bit more complicated. So the first point that we worked with and came up with was that God only speaks to people in ways they can understand. Somebody give me an explanation of what that's talking about.
What's the question?
What does it mean, the first point, God only speaks to people in ways that they can understand?
He speaks to them the best way that he knows that they'll understand.
Based on what? What determines what a person's able to understand?
What they think, how they think, what their
general context of how they go through day to day. If you can't, you speak in a higher level, you wouldn't understand it and you wouldn't comprehend it. You basically, what are you talking about? You know.
Right. So essentially, God knows a lot more than we do. And there are things that God understands and has known that it's taken man centuries to ever pick up on. And if you tried to talk to us too far in advance of what we had the ability to understand, there would be no communication that went on. We had something that we discussed: locution, illocution, and perlocution. Does any of that sound familiar?
Yes.
Can anybody remember what those terms referred to?
Oh. Give me a second.
Locution, illocution, and perlocution. Yes.
There's one referred to him contacting you in a non-mental way, sort of.
No, that's not necessarily what this is addressing. Has to deal with the mechanism through which communication occurs, the way that communication happens. You've got a sender, you've got a receiver, you've got a message you're trying to communicate. There's a certain process that goes about, and we talked about it being LIPS, L-I-P, locution, illocution, and perlocution. That, Ms. Francine?
Okay. It seems that way it works for me. The blessings that I know he's answered might have been something already on my heart and in my mind, not speaking it out among people, but knowing that it's something that I would really like to be able to handle and express. And the very next day or within that same week, those things come to light.
Okay.
And I know it was him because it's nothing I did.
So when God communicates with you, he's trying to show you something specific.
Yes.
And when we're talking about speech act theory and locution and illocution and those words, God has a specific intention behind him trying to communicate.
Right.
There's something that he wants you to see.
Yeah.
He uses the circumstances as a way of trying to communicate that with you. And then you're able to pick up and figure it out. What that breaks down into, locution is a specific intent behind what God says. Illocution is the way of communicating it. We communicate via text, via Facebook Messenger, phone calls, writing letters. These are all methods of communication. Body language, facial expressions, breathing out hot air when you get irritated, rolling your eyes. They all communicate stuff. They are all various forms of illocution or mechanisms for communicating an idea. And then perlocution is what the actual person understands. So just because I say something to you with a specific intent doesn't mean that you necessarily picked up what I was trying to say or what the intent is. That's your perlocution, what you actually derive from it.
At one point you said it's the results of your statement. So
Right.
what you say to me and how I receive it, what I do with it.
Right. And we've talked about it a little. In fact, yes.
You had an example like when you said something about you switching up switch and railway thing, I guess.
Right. If I were to talk about my job,
Yeah.
and I said we changed out a substation switch, a lot of people would be thinking, or if I said we changed out a switch at a substation, a lot of people would be thinking that I'm talking about a light switch, because that's their understanding of what a switch is.
Right.
And they have no idea necessarily how many different things. If I say that to you, you're just thinking, okay, you pulled out, I substituted a switch. If I say that to somebody who works my job, they know there's about 30 different steps that are involved and things that you had to do. Behind that simple statement, I changed out a switch at a substation. That single statement means something completely different depending on who's hearing it and what their background is.
Okay.
Right?
That does.
So how much stuff gets communicated what all is communicated in that statement has as much to do with the person receiving the communication as it does with the person making the statement. So the same thing tends to apply to the way that God interacts with us. And we said that God works with us and our level of understanding and how we understand the world at the time. Right? So we said that God did not necessarily correct people and tell them that the earth was not the center of the universe. Right? That he may have talked to people and communicated based on their understanding the earth being the center of the universe, when really the sun was the center of the universe, if God was not trying to give a lesson in astronomy. If God wanted to talk about his faithfulness and he said the sun comes up and the sun goes down every day, in real terms, the sun does not go up or go down at all. It stays in the exact same place.
Amen.
But our worldview says that the sun goes up and comes down. So he'll talk to you and say, look how I keep the sun going up and coming down every day. Even though that hasn't, because that he's not trying to correct us scientifically.
Right.
He's just trying to communicate to us about his faithfulness. Right? So we said that we talked about high context and low context communication. What's the difference between the two? What is what are high context and low context communication? Yours.
High context communication, I think, is when God tries to communicate to you, especially in a way that he knows that you'll understand.
Close. It has nothing to do with God, though.
In general, it's people are aware of something that in that culture they deal with it day by day. The low and the high, it'll miss the person who's outside the loop in general.
Other way around. High context communication will go over somebody's head if they're not part of the group. So, Sam, you should be able to understand this from dealing with customers who come in and think that they know their equipment and know what they're talking about. Some people do when you can just talk to them in music terminology or in equipment terminology, you know that they know what they're talking about. And other people, you have to break stuff down to a real low level and get them to, this is a stick. This stick is made out of wood. This wood stick is this thick and we'll break it. And you have to get real specific and baby step with them. That's low context communication, where we got to take you step by step by step, because really, as opposed to if you're talking to a drummer and you say that you use Vic Firth, then they know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I don't know what that means.
Exactly. So high context communication, I'm talking to a drummer, I say I need a set of Vic Firth and whatever thickness I'm looking for, and I'm not a drummer, so I don't know the typical size, but you know. And so you say it. He comes in, he tells you I need this, you know exactly what he's talking about, you grab it, you give it to him, because y'all share a common knowledge base. Question.
So it's like, because I'm a quiet person and I know musical stuff, and I go to another person and start talking about crescendos, decrescendos, retardandos, and all that kind of stuff.
I'm not a quiet person.
And they understand it. That's a high context thing.
Yeah, that's a high context thing.
Talk to me about that.
As opposed to, all right, if you talk to them, it goes over their head.
You have to break it down.
Because it's high context. It goes over their head because they don't have a knowledge base. They're not part of that culture. Okay? So, one of the questions that we asked before, is the Bible a high context book or a low context book? On what? Do you think that there's anybody who reads the Bible today for which it would be a high context book?
Yeah.
No.
I think so.
You sure? Wait.
Why do you think it would be high context?
Because you could read it and not quite understand it, but if you have someone that you are discussing the same verses or whatever, and each the other person can break it down to you. Whereas if you do it by yourself, it's not always something.
So that would make it low context.
Well, okay, that's Logan.
Yeah, the Bible was
That's Logan. I'm sorry.
for the people that were in the Bible. It was all high context to them.
Right.
They communicated in ways where they all knew what they were talking about.
Okay.
Right. So one of the difficulties that we have when we read the Bible, one of the reasons why you got to sit and get nitty gritty is because we're completely removed.
Right.
So they can say something, salt of the earth. You are the salt of the earth.
Yeah.
There's a specific imagery that everybody knew and understood at that point in time. We're completely removed from that. And so we have to sit and try to figure out what does salt of the earth mean, because we don't share a common knowledge base.
That's right.
We don't have dung patties that we use to fire up earth furnaces. Nobody does that anymore. So there's a specific context to the statements, and we as dung patty furnaces.
What?
All right, let me give a quick explanation.
Okay, please.
You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. You know, you've heard that verse before, right?
Mhm.
If a salt loses its savor, it's good for nothing to be except to be tread on by the foot of man. Back in the day, okay, let me tell you what we interpret that as from a more modern perspective. We say that if a salt isn't salty anymore, it's not going to make you thirsty. It's not good for nothing anymore, right? So it's useless because salt is supposed to make people thirsty. That's not what they were actually talking about, because salt never becomes not salty. It's just in its physical characteristics. But what they used to do is that they wouldn't make, you know, you do fire pits?
Yeah.
Or you can make a dirt fire pit, dig into the dirt, put your tinder in there, set stuff on fire. Yeah, they used to make they would make earthen furnaces, right? Earth furnaces. And what they would use for charcoal briquettes, since they didn't have that, was dried out dung. And the way that they got dung, like animal dung.
Okay. Yeah, I know what you mean now.
And the way that they got the dung to dry out is that they have big blocks of salt. Salt pulls water out of objects. If you've ever seen table salt that's been sitting out, it starts turning colors, right? It's because it's pulling the moisture out of the air. So salt pulls moisture out of objects. So if you put something on salt, if you salt something and leave it, it'll dry it out. Once it gets dried out underneath the light of the sun, it starts to smolder and it can catch fire. So you put the dung patties on the blocks of salt. The salt absorbs the moisture. You set it in there, it catches fire. Yes.
What is animal dung?
Poop, manure.
Okay, so
Okay. So, and eventually what happens is that the salt becomes saturated, right? The surface of the salt gets to the point where it can't keep drawing water because it's drawing up too much moisture. It turns colors. And what they would do is that they take those salt blocks and make them bricks for Roman soldiers. They take the salt block, put it in mud. Like if the path was too muddy to walk on, they put the salt in mud and it would be walked on by soldiers. Like they'd make walkways with that after the salt had been saturated. So Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth. If a salt loses its savor, it's not good for anything except to be tread under the foot of men. He's saying that once the salt loses its ability to make things catch fire, the only thing it's good for is to be walked on.
Oh my goodness, that is amazing.
So you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. It means that you are supposed to be agents that cause things to catch fire. That's the metaphor. And he didn't have to explain all that to them,
Right.
because they already lived there. High context communication, completely different metaphor. We spend, years of study, dollars on books to go back and try to deconstruct all that stuff, because the metaphor, honestly, that metaphor preaches a lot better when you deal with the fact that we're supposed to be helping people to catch on fire than it does, well, if you're not making nobody thirsty, no, you're not supposed to make them thirsty. You're supposed to make them catch fire. You're supposed to make them transform. Fire is something that I'm going to shut up and keep moving. So that's what that's one of the things that we dealt with: high context, low context communication. 3 ways that God reveals himself, and 3 ways that people perceive or experience God. I don't know if you guys remember, but this was the time when we had the chart and we had the multiple colors, and we said that God has revealed himself in 3 ways, and there are 3 ways, depending on a person's personality and their disposition, that a person can perceive or experience God. And that sound familiar?
yes.
Good Lord, I'm running out of time. Because I do have some things. So I'm going to kind of just touch on that because I don't want to, because we are actually running through this pretty quick, or running out of time anyway. God reveals himself as creator, through his son, and through the Holy Ghost. Those are the 3 ways that people, before there was Jesus, the only thing people had was creation. They knew that God was the creator. Jesus comes and they see him as a son, and they see God through him. Then the Holy Ghost comes and people experience him and see him through spirit. People perceive God and understand God along those three bases as well. There's some people that will look at plants, they interact with nature, and they understand and relate to God that way, right? That's what they do. They love God. There's some people, somebody will come to me or might come to me and say, I wish I could do as much reading as you do. Don't do that, because that's not what works for you. You love gardening. If you want to commune with God, you go out, you work in your garden by yourself, and you just do stuff and have a good time with God, because that's where they are, and that's what they interact with God that way. Other people who perceive God through their mind or through an intellectual basis like to do a lot of reading. And then there's people that relate with one another, and they understand God as they are of service to people. That's what speaks to them spiritually, is doing things for others, trying to be a blessing, doing charity work. That's through doing those things, they touch God, and they can feel God touching them back. And then there's other people who they interact with God on a spiritual basis. They like to shout, they like to speak in tongues, they want the prophecies. That's their mechanism, that's their avenue. So based on people's personalities, and we did we did kind of an assessment, a survey for people to kind of see where they are, what's their strong points, what are they weak at, because realistically, we want to be well balanced. We want to be able to feel and experience God everywhere.
Yes.
We talked about, and I'm going to, how do I want to do this? Personal communication with God is sacred, and it takes place at sacred times and spaces. Just real quick, does anybody remember what part of the Bible we used to pull that discussion from? What?
The burning bush.
Right. God calls Moses away, gets his attention, pulls him out of his normal routine to get time away with him, to talk with him. Moses in the burning bush, that was where we dealt with that. And we talked about the fact that personal communication with God centers around two things. Do I have that in your notes, or did I? What are the two things that, when you're interacting with God, there are two things that you are going to learn over the course of that process? Right. Who am I and who is he? You get to know yourself better. You get to know who God is better. Consequently, as you get to understand those two things better, your world starts to look a little bit different too. You experience and understand the things around you differently. I'm going to move on, because I have something else I want to get to, and you can look through the rest of the points, and if you have questions, we can come back to those.
Okay, sounds good.
But we talked about the fact that God's ability to communicate with us is limited by our ability to understand it. And it's limited by the way that we see and understand the world at a specific time, right? So here's one of the questions that I wanted to deal with. What happens when what God wants to show me goes past the way that I understand the world to be? When it either challenges or exceeds the way that I understand the world.
Won't he advance you to what he's trying to say or trying to get you to understand?
Will he advance you? What do y'all think?
I would think that he would. First of all, he's going to know if you understand or not.
Right.
But I think that depending on, he's going to know how you react. But I think that he would make it so that you understand it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe almost block you in so that you have to understand it. Drop it in your lap.
But
I don't know.
what if your worldview makes it so that you can't understand it? And what has to happen for you to get it?
Break you down.
What gets broken down?
You.
What about you?
Your
Spirit.
No.
Let me restate it. I said that what happens when your worldview stops you from being able to understand?
He will take you out the world.
He will what?
He'll take you out the world.
He will take you out the world, or he breaks down your worldview. Now, your worldview is the way that you understand everything around you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you hit a wall. The way that you understand reality, the way that you understand human interaction, the way that you understand family structures, the way that you understand marriages, the way that you understand kids, allows you to understand everything in a specific way. But God wants to show you something that's a little bit past what that will allow you to experience. What ends up happening to happen is that he has to break down that understanding of your reality. And that is a complicated process. And I'm going to move a little bit quick here and we'll stop for questions. But the fact that God only speaks to people in a way that they can understand and only shares things that they have the capacity to apprehend sets up an interesting dynamic between God and the individual. People are limited in communicating with God by the way they understand the world, yet God's perspective of the world is what defines what's true. So we understand our world and we can only interact with God based on the way we understand the world, but God's got a perspective that's going to dictate what's real and what's not real. This sets up an inevitable and uncomfortable for the individual confrontation when God decides to speak truths that challenge the worldview of a person. As an individual grows closer to God, there are benchmarks wherein the only way to continue the journey is for God to shift the fundamental paradigm or worldview through which he or she understands the world. If this process is not undertaken successfully, then the relationship ceases to grow. So me and God, we walked so far, and now he wants to get you used to the idea that man can fly in an airplane. And if I'm convinced man can't fly in an airplane and won't set foot on the airplane to find out if we can fly in the airplane, then this is as far as we get. That's where the relationship stops, and we end up stuck in circles right there, not getting on the airplane or the boat or whatever this revelation is that challenges what we believed about the world. There is a natural communication gap that exists whenever two normal people have different perspectives on reality and they're very far apart. Y'all know what it's like to talk to people who think completely differently than you do when you try to talk to them. There's a gap there. Within that normal process, the solution to the problem is that you work to come to a meeting of the minds, which is a complicated enough process. But when God is involved, the process is different. When you're dealing with people, the assumption is that both perspectives have some degree of validity to them. We just can't see where the other one is coming from. No such presumption exists when communicating with God. The perspective of the individual is entirely invalid and irrelevant, and the perspective of God is the only truth. That is a difficult pill to swallow in and of itself. That what you thought, what your mama did, what your grandmama did, what you got taught has nothing to do with what's actually real, and the only thing that matters is what God is trying to tell you. There are bishops, there are grand poobah apostles sent out by that can't quite get that idea. There is no middle ground to find. We're not going to have a meeting of the minds. We're not going to come to an understanding. This is what it is, and you can accept it, or we can move, or you can stay stuck. This typically takes place through one of two mechanisms. At times, God can speak directly to an individual through one of the three relational avenues, mind, soul, and heart, and open their eyes to a new way of thinking that resolves long-standing questions or conflicts. In other words, there are times where God can speak to you and you've had all these issues that you're wrestling with, and all of a sudden what he speaks makes everything click and come together. Just turns on the light switch. That's a beautiful thing. Everybody's happy when that happens. That's not usually the way that it goes, though, because people are a little bit more stubborn than that. The more complicated and more common way of paradigm shifting is that God allows or facilitates circumstances under which the previously held worldviews are inadequate to handle, to befall a person. In other words, God puts me in a situation where what I thought just don't work no more. God puts me in a situation where what I believed isn't getting things done. And every which way I try to figure out how to do it in a way that makes sense to me does nothing but create more problems than it solves. There's a proverb that says, there is a way in a man's heart that seemeth right, but the end thereof is destruction. In other words, me trying every solution that makes sense to me based on my understanding perspective of the world is likely to only make matters worse or create new complications. I think that we've experienced at some point in life, and if you haven't, keep living because it's coming, points in time where what you thought you knew of the world just is not working out for you very well anymore. In this molding process, the unthinkable becomes reasonable. core beliefs become questioned, and the psyche becomes desperate to reassert some semblance of control over the situation. Those who abort this process through reactionary decision-making find themselves stuck in an unyielding cycle that they never intended to be in. Those who continue to walk with God and engage in relational discourse find that over time, these situations work themselves out, and they come away understanding God, themselves, and the world better. So here's the way this plays out. You hit a wall, and I keep banging my head into that wall because I'm trying to do what makes sense to me. And God has allowed a situation to come up that's a little bit more complicated than my intelligence can handle. I thought I was smart. I thought I knew how stuff was supposed to work. And all of a sudden, every which way I turn, things are only going to get worse. Every decision I make is going to make things more complicated, and I have to figure out what to do. Now, there are some people who will say, I need to do something, so I'm going to do something. And then that something ends up going badly for them, blows up in their face, or there's unintended consequences. And then they end up right back in the same place and having to face the same kind of decision, the same decision over again. So they figure, I need to do something, and they do something again, and that puts them right back where they began. And they're going around and around because the situation is intended to show you a worldview that is different than what you've assumed. The other option is relating with God, walking a day at a time, communicating with him, trying to hear from him, and over time, you end up further up the road, and the situation has worked itself out in a way that you couldn't have anticipated because your worldview did not allow you to process the possibilities that God is trying to show you. One example of this that we've talked about before is when God calls Moses the burning bush. God tells Moses something that fundamentally challenges who Moses believes himself to be. And rather than run away, Moses asks God questions. So when God tells Moses, I want you to go tell Pharaoh, let my people go, instead of running away saying, I ain't doing that, Moses actually asks questions. And along the way, through the process of talking to God, comes to understand God differently, comes to understand himself differently. Another example would be Abraham walking up the mountain to sacrifice his son Isaac, not knowing not knowing exactly how things were going to work themselves out. So Abraham and Isaac. Isaac is the promised child. He's the only child Abraham has had. Abraham's been waiting 25 years for this kid to get here. Finally gets here. 13 years later, God says, I want you to go sacrifice this kid to me. And Abraham actually goes about the process of doing this. As unthinkable as that may be for all of us, he walks in obedience to God and has no clue necessarily how this is going to work out. I sometimes wonder if when he told Isaac God will provide, he was just telling him, shut up, boy, it's going to work out, because he didn't have an answer. That's just me thinking. Maybe his faith, maybe he knew that if I strike Isaac dead, he's going to come back to life. Maybe he knew, but for us, when we try to put ourselves in that position, God is asking me to do something that is absolutely unthinkable, and I don't have time to talk about the magnitude of killing your firstborn, because there was something attached to that. There was a lot attached to that. So he raises the knife, and then God steps in and speaks.
Yes.
And he comes to understand God's providence and faithfulness to his plan better than he would have if he would have told Isaac, get your butt up and run. But he has to walk through this process of doing something that's unthinkable. And every single step along the way, there's a degree of uncertainty about how this whole thing's going to work out. But he doesn't try to figure this out on his own. He just walks with God in a relationship based on what God is telling him. We can talk about Job, Joseph, Mary, Jacob, any number of individuals in the Bible that found themselves undergoing this kind of process. And they successfully endured the process because life forced them to continue on, and they didn't abandon their interaction and relationship with God. Always remember that God at times presents difficult concepts with the expectations that they will draw you deeper into dialogue with him. I'm gonna run a little bit over if you don't mind, if nobody has any place that they have to run to, because there's a couple of things that I want to hit. And everybody good? All right, we're gonna keep going with this. One of the things that we talked about is that can you give me water? One of the things that we've talked about in the past is that when God speaks, he brings order to chaos and disorder.
Right.
You guys remember that?
Mhm.
Do you remember? Little one's fine. Do you guys remember what chaos and disorder were? Those were technical terms. Thank you. Chaos and disorder. What were we talking about when we said those?
Wasn't it the snake?
Mm-mm. What's the difference between chaos and disorder?
Oh. Disorder is your world is different. Your world was good, then changed and something else. Chaos is when it started off. That's bad.
Close. You're right along the edges of it.
And disorder is, it serves a purpose. It has a meaning. It's in order. It's just jumbled up. Chaos is just complete, utter mess. It doesn't serve a purpose. It doesn't work for any situation.
Okay. Also, that's closer. We talked about what it means for something to be created. We said that for us, something is created because it has physical properties. We can feel it, we can touch it. That for them, if something did not have distinct form, function, and distinction, then it didn't exist yet. We said for things to be in chaos meant that they had no form, function, or distinction. There was no assigned function to them. They just existed, but they didn't have a function. They didn't have a purpose. There was nothing that they were actually organized to exist for. To be in disorder meant to have a function, but to no longer be serving that function. It's lost that usefulness and that ability to be used. Okay? So something that's in chaos has no function to it. Something that's in disorder has lost its ability to function the way it was designed to function. Okay? So we said that when God speaks, he sets chaos, he sets order or purpose to chaos and disorder. So once God sets a life in order, how is it that it ends up falling back into disorder? And how do we restore order? We said that God speaks, order is set. Well, if God is speaking and order is being set and God is speaking to us, then how do our lives end up becoming chaotic and disorderly sometimes? Theories?
Well, you run into that wall that you were talking about. Your worldview and what God is trying to get you to is not meeting.
Okay, that's one possibility. Any other ideas on how we end up? We're looking for God to speak to us, and God has spoke to us, and we have those moments of clarity where the world just makes sense. And then if you live long enough, all of a sudden it gets blown up. And now your life seems to be filled with chaos and disorder. How's that end up happening? All right, let's talk about it a little bit. I got a couple ideas. Every Christian knows that chaos and disorder are a part of living in a chaotic and disorderly world. Believers also know that they are not immune to these forces in their own lives. Much is said of purpose, direction, destiny, and promise in pulpits across Christendom on a weekly basis, yet life seems to be uncooperative and incompatible with these propositions. When nothing in life, from the car to the dishwasher to the relationship with the kids, parents, and spouses, seem to work the way that it's supposed to, it can cause even the most devout disciple to find themselves in crisis and wondering how such circumstances could befall them. Now, I don't know if anybody's ever been in a situation where nothing is working the way it's supposed to. I mean, everything that's supposed to work a specific way has broken down. It's acting funny, and just everything is jacked up. Just everything. Car, job, the sidewalk, the dog is peeing on the carpet for no apparent. Just everything is going wrong.
Mhm.
There are several avenues from which this issue could be approached. The most common avenue is the adversarial nature of the Christian struggles. Believers have an enemy and an adversary who does seek to deceive and devour. It may be helpful and interesting to note that before the devil was known as the devil or understood to be evil, he was understood to be an agent of disorder. In creation, God set a natural order, and the devil sought to disrupt that order. That basic dynamic has been set at play in the lives and mechanizations of nature ever since. So it should not surprise Christians that we are not exempt from having chaos and disorder delivered to our doorstep. In other words, one of the things that we have to deal with is the fact that we do have an adversary, and part of his job and part of what he does is to try to induce chaos and disorder where order has been set. So the fact that at one point in time life made sense, and you just went about living life the way that made sense and the way that worked, and it was actually healthy and was functional, things were good, and all of a sudden stuff starts turning upside down. There is an agent of disorder that's out there who looks to cause that to happen. That's one side of the equation, and you can never discount that fact. Another facet of this discussion is that people are free moral agents and they're relational beings. Excuse me. So number one, you've got somebody out there that is trying to induce disorder, and nobody's immune to it. Number two, you're dealing with people who are free moral agents, and everybody are relational beings. We talked about that in the past, that we are built to want to have relationships with people around us, with our family, with our friends. We're built that way, but no matter how orderly your life would be, everybody around you, whether you raise them or not, are free moral agents. What that means is that with every relationship, or that means believers are naturally going to desire to have relationships with people. We're not exempt from that. God didn't build us that way. Number two, the people with whom they have relationships are going to do what they're going to do. With every relationship, there is a degree of exposure to the dysfunction in the lives of other people. And it is only through establishment of healthy boundaries that transference can be minimized. So in other words, we're built to want relationships with people. Other people are going to do what they do. And sometimes their mess is going to seep its way into your life, unless you have built healthy boundaries. And we've touched on boundaries. We've never got deep into them. But only by establishing and maintaining healthy boundaries do we keep their disorder from seeping its way into our lives. Interestingly enough, or unfortunately, boundaries are a lot of work to establish and maintain. It takes work to them. For some reason, it's especially difficult to establish and maintain boundaries with people whose lives are disorder and chaos. In other words, the very ones whose stuff you want to keep outside of your yard are the hardest ones to keep outside of your yard.
Amen.
That's the nature of the beast, is that the people with the most drama are the ones that are going to be pushing up on your boundaries the most often and get indignant with you for having boundaries to begin with. Regardless of how saved a person may be and how Holy Ghost feel and how much time they spend in their Bible and how much time they spend doing whatever else they're doing, if everyone around them and everyone with whom they associate is chaotic and disorderly, it's highly likely that eventually a chunk of that will get dumped into their life. So we're dealing with the question, if God spoke to me and my life is in order, then why do I feel, why at one point in time, then how did things end up falling apart? Sometimes you got so many people attached to you that have stuff that eventually ends up getting dumped on you. And then you are left with the dilemma, do I go off on a mountainside and live by myself? Is that when nobody else has to bother me? And the answer is, well, you could do that, but eventually you're a relational being. You're going to want to have a relationship with somebody, and that somebody is going to have stuff. It's just part of the game. But the healthier your boundaries are, and the more well-established they are, the more you can minimize people dumping their mess into you and into your lives. That is, for a young man, why it's so important to be careful who you date and who you get involved with, because eventually their baggage is going to end up on your doorstep. That's the way it works. Or maybe inside your doorstep, depending on how you handle the situation.
Yep.
The last side of this that we have to discuss is that, and Delisa touched on this, that sometimes what appears to be disorder and chaos are actually the fires through which God is forging us into something different than we used to believe ourselves. So even though it seems to be disorderly, it's actually working exactly what God planned on working. What's more troubling and much more difficult to deal with than chaos and disorder from outside is chaos when chaos and disorder become internalized. Everything we've been dealing with now has been dealing with situations and circumstances that just aren't the way that we want them to be, and they're getting on our nerves, and life is crazy and things are going nuts. But that's outside stuff. What ends up really taking its toll on us and messing with us and causing us the biggest problem, that's what's a lot harder to deal with, is when chaos and disorder go beyond touching your life to being internalized, to where, in other words, there's a stark difference between being in the midst of chaotic situations and being in an internal state of chaos. Christ, in the midst of a chaotic storm, was asleep on a ship. And when he was awoke by his disciples, he imposed the order in him onto the disorder around him. I can preach that too. It's uncommon, though, for the average person to fare quite that well. Many people find their in the midst of chaotic situations, many people find their thoughts and emotions to become out of control and without order. Their priorities and principles become scrambled, and instead of nothing around them working as designed, they no longer function as designed. Sometimes you feel like you are up to your neck in it, and eventually it seeps into your pores, and it's people call it toxicity. Toxic relationships, toxic circumstances. Yep. They're toxic not because they're outside you, but because they begin to permeate you. This is a much more complex and nuanced situation, as the contributing factors are often specific to the individual. However, in broad terms, such circumstances speak to the current condition of the person's relationship with God. In other words, when it starts to seep inside me, it's some way, shape, or form, it started to erode my relationship with God. Either my aggravation or my frustration has caused a barrier to become erected, or I've become resentful and I've become angry, and all of a sudden I can't quite reach God the way that I was once able to. When it becomes internalized and you become dysfunctional as opposed to your circumstances, in some way, shape, or form, it's a measure of the fact that the circumstances have started to touch on how you're relating with and interacting with God. It's God who determines and reassures a person of their purpose, function, and priority. And it's faith in God, in who God has revealed himself to be, that anchors a person in their storms. In other words, God is what dictates who I am. God is what dictates how I should function. He's the one who reassures me and lets you know it's okay. I've got you. You're doing what you're supposed to be. God, and it is our relationship with God and our faith in who God has revealed himself to be that should anchor and insulate us. We talked about at one point in time that when God communicates with a person, we laid out 5 things. He establishes truths about who he is. He invites a person to interact with him. He establishes a basis for trust, and then he leaves it for the person to decide if they're going to accept what he's presented. Going back to Moses in the burning bush. Come on into holy ground. I'm God. That's an invitation. And then Moses has to make a decision about whether or not he's going to step forward. He says, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I want you to go and tell Pharaoh to let my people go. What's in your hand? You've got a rod. You can do. And then Moses has to make a decision. Do I accept? God's taken me so far. Now, do I accept this truth? God takes me a little bit further. Do I accept this truth? And when I get to the point where I have a hard time processing and accepting that truth, then we stay right there until I get it. When external chaos begins to seep into the mind, soul, and heart of an individual, there is a fundamental question about what they choose to believe regarding their relationship with God thus far, and what they believe about what God has spoken to them. When I find myself in crisis, one of the things that gets challenged is is God who I believe he has been? Is God really who he has shown himself to be up to this point? Or was all of that a lie? What do I believe about God? What do I believe about the experiences that I've had with God? What do I believe about the miracles that I claim that he's performed in the past of my life? Yeah. There becomes a dilemma, because I have to decide, what do I believe? Because if those things are true, then my crisis has to go away. If those things are, if they're not true, then I got a much bigger problem. But if I choose to believe that God is who he has shown himself to be, then there's no reason for the dysfunction to be inside of me.
Yes.
There's no reason for me to break down and stop being who God designed me to be because of the external circumstances. These are the moments where, regardless of how unpleasant and overwhelming the external circumstances are, it all boils down to the individual with God on one shoulder and chaos with the devil on the other shoulder. So it doesn't matter how much hell and how many things are going crazy around me. What it boils down to is me, and there's God, and there's the devil. Now, usually when you see that scenario in the cartoons, it's when a person is trying to decide if they're going to do something.
Right.
And God is telling you you should do something, and the devil is telling you you should do something else. Realistically, there's a much more critical point that gets before the action, where God is telling you, believe me, and the devil is telling you you can't believe what you've known. That's where the real conflict is. What am I going to believe about God? Is this real, or have I been hosed? And I got to make a decision what I'm going to believe, because when it internalizes and corrodes, when that relationship is no different than me and Carmen. And at some point in time, if we're not spending, if we're not doing, if she's always off doing something else, at some point in time, I had to start to wonder naturally, does she actually care about me the way that she says she does, the way that I thought she did? Maybe she's going through a bad time at the moment.
Okay.
Maybe it's just complicated right now. And so there's a lot of things going on. But I got to figure out, she's dealing with all this mess, but we're not connected the way we used to. Maybe because life has taken its toll on her, but we're not connected the way that we used to be. And I have to ask myself, do I believe what we've experienced for the past 6 years? Or do I believe that what I'm experiencing now is what's real? Which reality is true? Have we loved, is she the person that I've known her to be and the person I believe her to be? Or is she the person that this box of circumstances and this chaos makes me wonder if she is? Getting back to God, what do I believe about God? Do I believe that he's the person, the guy he's shown himself to be? Or maybe none of it's real. And when we're in crisis to the point where our relationship with God has started to become undermined, that's really what's at stake. That's really the dynamic that comes into play. It doesn't matter how many therapists you go to and what they diagnose you with and what medication they want to prescribe and whatever else is going on and how many, what it boils down to, what do I believe about God? Who do I believe God is? To clarify, the clarity to be able to make that decision comes through consecration. And I'm almost done. I appreciate you guys' patience, but I thought that this was worth getting to for today. And maybe you've got everything going crazy around you. How do I know? How do I make this decision? Where do I find the clarity when my mind and my emotions and everything else are overwhelmed? It comes through being consecrated. And that was almost the last set of lessons that we talked about were the role of consecration. And we talked about alternate states of consciousness with relation to consecration. What does it mean to be consecrated and how does it help one hear from God? In the previous 2 or 3 lessons of this series, we addressed from a very high level the idea of alternate states of consciousness, the human's physiological capacity to experience reality on varying levels, and the idea of having spiritual encounters within these altered states. We talked about driving or road hypnosis. We talked about people talking and all of a sudden you're bored and your mind kicks out, and even though everything physiologically says that the sound is hitting the sound waves are making their way into the ear canal, stimulating the hairs on your ear, the neurotransmitters and chemicals that are supposed to come from the hairs in your ear are translating to your brain. All that's working, but you don't hear nothing. Or you're falling asleep. I see you. It's warm in here. But you go through alternate states of consciousness throughout your normal life. We don't necessarily talk about it that way because our culture doesn't have that component or believe it. Right. But in almost every other culture in the world, there are rituals for being able to present yourself into alternate states of consciousness and try to have spiritual experience. It's also been discussed that To be consecrated means to be set apart. We talked about what does it mean to be consecrated. Consecrated means to be set apart. What does that mean? In practice, it is to commit time, energy, and thought to preparation for a significant or sacred event or encounter. In other words, my time, my energy, my thoughts, what I'm focused on is preparing for a moment or preparing for a process. When I have a concert, if I have to sing, if I have to go to church and I have to lead praise service, I'm not going to get there 2 minutes before service starts, run up and think I'm going to sing. I'm going to prepare myself mentally, emotionally, spiritually, focus my energy before I get there. So that way, because what I'm about to do is important. And when I get up there, everything that I've done has been in preparation for that moment. That's what it means to be consecrated. And it is a compilation of activities that treat the event with the weight of what it's worth. So as a musician, and you remember we used to talk about this, when we had something big going, we'd be there half hour just sitting in the dark over on that side, just sitting, getting our head together, pulling ourselves together, because we want something to happen. We want to be in a position for things to happen. And so we would just sit in quiet with whatever was going on in our heads, clear ourselves to be prepared for ministry. The reason that consecration is critical is that in an altered state experience, the individuals backfill the experiences with latent discourse of cultural bias, as well as their present emotional and psychological. All right, how can I explain that quickly? We've talked about going into alternate states of consciousness, right? That we can work ourselves, and professional athletes do it. When they're about to go, they have their rituals that they go through to get them ready to play. Well, one of the things that happens consistently that's been studied is that when you have an alternate state experience, you bring the cultural interpretations of what you're going on into that experience with you. So if I dream about fish, I know a specific thing that it means that somebody's probably pregnant, because I've been enculturated to believe that dream of fish is pregnancy. If I'm having an alternate state and not experiencing God is trying to show me somebody's pregnant, then maybe I dream about fish, because there's an already understood. Somebody else might in another country might dream about a worm. And to them, and they're within their cultural discourse, that's what that means. So we bring our cultural discourse and our latent discourse and our cultural experiences into that. So and it affects what we see and what we interpret. We also bring our emotional state and our emotions, our thoughts, and our feelings at that time into that experience. So, and for example, if a novice to meditation, one of the ways that people go into alternate states is that they meditate. One of the ways that people get ready for basketball games is they'll sit, and some people sit in quiet, some people listen, whatever their ritual is. But if you meditate, one of the things that you will find out, you quiet down all the noise around you, right? Then you work on quieting your mind, okay? If you quiet your mind, one of the things that you will find out is that your emotions go from 0 to 100 a lot of times, depending on what you've had going on. When your mind gets quiet, all of the feelings that you've been too busy to listen to and deal with and that you've suppressed come up to the surface in that meditation. So you're bringing your emotional content with you into that place where you're trying to go and have yourself in a different frame of mind, in a different state. In other words, once a person eliminates the distractions and calms their mind, then everything that was drowned out can now be heard. These things can impede a person's ability to enter an altered state or have great effect on their experiences within these states. This is why you cannot go up and preach when you ticked off. Because if you preach when you ticked off, it's coming across the pulpit.
Yeah, right. That's true.
This is why you can't get up and preach when you fresh. I'm just speaking about my own experiences. There have been times when God has given me sermons, or I have seen something in scripture, and he has told me, don't preach that right now. You're too upset about it. Because it would have impeded my ability to be effective if I would have brought my emotions into the pulpit and just hammered on people. When we go to encounter and when we go to interact with God, the emotional content that we have can become a distraction. And that's one of the challenges of consecration. To consecrate oneself is to separate oneself from people, other people's attitudes, or my own attitudes, which are profane relative to the event that's going. It means that I commit myself, mind, soul, heart, energy, thoughts, and emotions to the moment or to the process at hand. It's fairly commonly understood that consecration requires separation from outside influences. What's often overlooked is the process of internal consecration. A person must not only separate themselves from outside distractions and from others, but from their own thoughts, and feelings have to become subject to this process. As it relates to hearing God's voice, the consecrated individual realizes that their own internal processes are simply distractions from the purity of God's presence. If I'm looking to hear from God, if I'm looking for God to speak to me, and one of the things wish I had more time, one of the things that at some point in time I want to double back to is the idea that sometimes we look to hear God's voice about a specific situation, as opposed to practicing the discipline of just looking to hear God speak. I don't need for you to tell me what I should do about my car. I just want to hear you talk to me. Because when you talk to me, something different happens inside me. When you talk to me, maybe my car doesn't need fixed all of a sudden but whatever it is, I need to hear you talk to me. I need to hear your voice. It's not about a specific situation. I'd like to get specific situation, but we become so situationally driven that God doesn't have room to say anything else. We don't leave him room to talk. We don't leave room for a relationship. We just want an answer. We want him to flip over a tarot card, read our palm, tell us what we're supposed to do so we can get back on about our lives, as opposed to being invested in the relationship and being disciplined that I just need to hear from you. This is going on in my life. This is going wrong. That's going wrong. I'm not looking for you to fix that, but I need to hear from you. I've got this emotional pain. I've got that emotional pain. I've got this situation that I don't know what to do with tomorrow. I've got that. I don't need you to fix that, but I need to hear something from you. That's what you look for in hearing God's voice. And my own feelings, my own thoughts, my own frustrations are something that I have to find the discipline in those moments that I'm looking to find God to separate myself from, because all they are is noise. Israel wrote the song that starts away, away, away from the noise. We think that means getting away from everything else that's going on, and that's part of it, but there's also noise that exists inside of us that if you don't find the discipline to learn to quiet and to settle, it can make it difficult to hear God's voice. Being consecrated is key. We talked about Israel consecrated themselves for 3 whole days before God came down to the mountain. That's where this whole process, this idea of consecration came from. When they accepted God's proposal, God says, go tell them to consecrate themselves for 3 days and I'll come and then I'll give them the law. They prepared themselves to put themselves in a position to hear from God. And for us, part of that is getting our own thoughts, ideas, feelings, the way we'd like to see things play out, our own outcomes, hopeful outcomes, out of the way for that moment when we're looking to hear from him. When we're talking to him about what we're feeling, we can deal with all that. I'm hurt, I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I've got this going on, I don't understand this, I don't understand that. But there comes a place of calm where we've got to scoot those things out of the way, push them aside, and just look to hear God's voice. This means that this is perhaps the most challenging part of true consecration, separation from self. It's not something that happens naturally, and even with a lifetime of walking with God, it can still be problematic at times. This is not to say that the individual is irrelevant, but to put it simply, when God speaks, the person shuts up. When God's ready to talk, what I think, what I feel, has to take a back seat. I can't be so emotionally distraught that God can't speak to me. And sometimes you get there. Sometimes you are so emotionally overwhelmed that the struggle and the battle is to calm yourself and find a place of calm to where God can speak to you. That's part of the discipline of life. That's part of the discipline of consecrating yourself. In this state, his voice becomes more distinct. His reassurances can be heard and felt. His heart and passions can be shared. His peace and his strength are transferred, and the path forward becomes more clear. It is the point of intimacy under which the heights of ecstasy and euphoria flow as rivers, and life can become renewed. That's where I find the clarity and the peace to just push on another day and to push on with tomorrow. Don't have the answers yet, don't have a clue which end is going to be up yet, but it is where when I consecrate myself to be able to hear God's voice and whatever it is that he wants to speak to me at that time, that I find my resolve, my strength, my peace to keep going. He may not say anything about the situation that I'm dealing with and may not give me any direction at that time. But if I am a disciple and if my primary concern is being engaged in the relationship with him, then the only thing I'm really looking to do is get to my safe place at the moment where I can get rest and relief from what I'm wrestling with. So to wrap up, this series on the nature of divine communication has presented a diverse and somewhat challenging set of concepts, and yet we have not scratched the surface. Just scratching the surface would take a lifetime of study. But these principles are foundational traits that exist within the discipline of what I'm going to start calling spiritual listening. Much of the discipline is unique to the individual and discovered within the relational process, but these are just high-level fundamental tendencies of spiritual listening. So far, we've been dealing with things from a very spiritual end. Moving forward, we're going to turn to hearing God speak through a study of Scripture. How do I read the Bible? How do I interact with the Bible in a way that allows God to speak to me? That's where we're headed next in dealing with that. But I wanted to bring us back from everything else we've been doing, excuse me, bring everybody's mindset back to what we've been discussing, because some of these principles are going to end up coming back around and understanding how do I hear God as I read Scripture, because that's another venue that people hear God through, sometimes more clearly than they hear it through the prophet or the preacher. Any last minute questions before we wrap?
Yes.
Yes.
What is the, this is actually about the point before consecration.
Chaos.
Chaos. What if you are in a situation where you have that devil and that on one shoulder, and he's creating a situation where he's asking you to, or creating a situation where he's showing you that the miracles that have happened, the good situations that have happened. Oh, sorry, I'm about to cry. Have happened, and you believe in them, but you still find yourself in this place where it doesn't seem like anything is working out.
Well,
You believe in the miracles,
right?
I mean, I thank you. Well, as we see it, speak. You see these things. You know these things. They are true. They are part of who you are. They're part of your psyche. They're part of your life. You have lived your life according to these things, and you get to the point where you believe all that God has done, but you don't believe in yourself. Because that's basically what it boils down to.
Well, a couple of things. What God has done is a part of a bigger picture. What God has done and the miracles that God works are there to point to a truth about who he is. And that's where you find, that's the beginning of where you find your faith. God has worked these miracles, and through experiencing these miracles, there is something about his character that he's sought to show you. And hopefully through the process of experiencing these things, not only have you learned more about what he can do, but you understand better who he is. And the issue begins with, do I still believe that the God I serve today is the same God, fundamentally in his character, as the one that worked these miracles? And if the God that worked these miracles in the past is the same in character as the one that I'm serving today, then the situations and the circumstances don't matter, because he's still the same God in his character. Even though the situations may point to something different, even though they may cause you, they may try to instill doubt, I choose to believe, and some of it boils down to a choice. I choose to believe that the God that I serve is the God that he showed himself to be in his character, that he has not lied to me. I had these experiences that I cannot doubt. As far as doubting myself goes, that's a much more complicated question. And one of the things that we've talked about, you interact with God, you relate with God, God reveals to you two things: who he is and who you are. Sometimes it's easier to, sometimes it's, sometimes it's easier to believe who God is than it is to believe who I am, because God exists and is immune to everybody else telling him what he's not. God exists and is in a different place to where he can just be who he is and not have to worry about other people causing him to doubt himself, because he's God. It never has to do with self-doubt. If I believe that God is who he says he is, and if I believe that he is who he has shown himself to be, then I have to believe that I am who he has declared that I am. And that is a challenge, and it's also a choice. Even though I have a lifetime of experiences telling me something different, even though I have current circumstances and present circumstances challenging me, even though I carry weight of scars and pain in my psyche, causing me to question and doubt myself, because I believe God is who he says he is, then I choose to believe that I am who God says that I am. When God speaks, he brings order to chaos and disorder. One of the interesting things about that process and the way that it works is that God does not have to speak to every single circumstance and situation to allow that to happen. He can say, let there be, and whatever has to happen for there to be, then there is. When you read creation account, he says, let the beast and, let there be a division between the waters of the earth and the waters of the sea. And whatever has to happen for that to happen ends up happening. One of the things I like as a more clear, vivid illustration is the valley of dry bones. Elijah sees the valley of dry bones. They're very dry. They have no meat on them, and they are indiscriminate. You can't tell one leg bone from another leg bone. You just got a big pile of bones. God tells Elijah, tell the bones to pull themselves together and for a body to be created. He doesn't have to speak to each individual bone. He makes a broad declaration. Tell the bones, God said, pull yourselves together. And every bone knows his connective part. Right. Every tissue knows where it's supposed to be. Even though they are without distinction, they're without form, they're without purpose, they're without use, when the broad word is spoken, come together, everything that's supposed to happen for them to be able to come together, God enables that to happen without having to be specific to the circumstances. He speaks words to us and tells us, this is who you're going to be. This is who you, not just who you are going to be, but who you are. And over the process of life, if we are obedient to God and faithful to the relationship, not just I do this, I do that, I don't do this, I commit this sin, but if I'm faithful to the relationship, we go through a process of transformation where everything that's supposed to pull me together to be what he has declared that I am happens. And then the challenge becomes, do I believe what everybody else is telling me about myself and what I am telling me about myself, or do I believe what God has told me about myself? Can God's word create a new reality for me and for who I believe myself to be? And it's a challenge that a lot of people have to deal with, and we talked about it a lot in the relational series. People will exploit you. They will treat you as though you don't matter. They'll treat you as though you are incapable, but you're not what people have treated you. You are what God says you are. You are who God says you are. And the only battle then becomes to find the strength and conviction to walk in that one day at a time to where you believe you're. I'm going to shut this off for a second because